The early morning sun cast a warm glow across James Wilson's backyard as he skimmed leaves from the surface of his swimming pool. At 52, his body still carried the strong build of his police days, though his hair had started graying at the temples. 25 years on the Atlanta police force had taught him patience and attention to detail, qualities that now served him well in retirement. "You're up early again," called his wife Diane from the back porch, 2 steaming coffee mugs in hand. Her smile still made his heart skip after 30 years of marriage. "Can't help it," James replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Old habits die hard. Besides, look at this view." They both gazed across their backyard. The in-ground pool glittered in the morning light, surrounded by potted plants and the small garden Diane had started. For a kid who grew up in a cramped apartment with 5 siblings, owning a home with a swimming pool felt like winning the lottery. "Our little piece of heaven," Diane said, squeezing his hand. 6 months ago, they'd packed up their old place and moved to this suburban neighborhood after James finally turned in his badge. The house wasn't fancy, a modest 3-bedroom with good bones and terrible wallpaper, but the backyard pool had sealed the deal. They'd spent weeks fixing it up, replacing the pump, retiling damaged sections, and learning the delicate science of pool chemistry. Their realtor had seemed surprised when they made an offer, her eyebrows raising slightly when they toured the neighborhood. James had noticed it, that look he'd seen countless times during his career. The silent question of whether they belonged here. But the neighbors had seemed friendly enough during move-in, bringing over casseroles and welcome cards. "Grandkids coming at noon?" Diane asked, interrupting his thoughts. "Yep. Told Lisa to bring their swimsuits. Gonna start teaching little Anthony how to float today." James couldn't help grinning at the thought of his 5-year-old grandson in the pool. The boy had been talking non-stop about swimming lessons ever since James promised to teach him. After breakfast, James walked the perimeter of his property, a habit from his police days. The wooden fence needed staining in spots, and he made a mental note to pick up supplies next week. Mr. Chen from next door waved from his garden, and James waved back. Good folks, the Chens. They'd brought over homemade dumplings when James helped them jump-start their car last month. As he rounded the corner of the house, James noticed a car slowing down in front of his driveway, an expensive SUV he didn't recognize. The driver, a blonde woman, stared at his property for a long moment before continuing down the street. Something about her gaze made the back of his neck prickle. Just being paranoid, he muttered to himself, shaking it off. The job had left him with a heightened sense of awareness that sometimes crossed into suspicion. Not everyone was a threat. Back inside, he helped Diane prepare lunch for the family visit. Their kitchen radio played old soul classics, and they moved around each other in the familiar dance of a long marriage, hips bumping occasionally as they worked. "You think we should join that neighborhood picnic next weekend?" Diane asked, slicing watermelon. "Might as well. Good to know who we're living next to." Mrs. Taylor from across the street mentioned something about a community watch. "Thought you might be interested, with your background and all." James nodded thoughtfully. "Could be, though I was hoping to leave all that behind." The doorbell rang, and moments later the house filled with the chaos of family, their daughter Lisa herding in the grandkids, Anthony racing toward James with his little arms outstretched. "Grandpa, I got my swimming shorts. Can we go in the pool now? Right now?" James laughed, scooping up the boy. "Slow down, buddy. Pool time after lunch." As his family gathered around the table, James felt a deep contentment. This was why he'd worked so hard all those years, for moments like this. His gaze drifted to the weekend arrived with blistering heat that made the sidewalks shimmer. James had spent the morning preparing for a small family barbecue, marinating chicken in his secret blend of spices, while Diane made her famous potato salad. "Going to be 98 degrees today," James said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he checked the grill's propane tank. "Pool's going to feel like heaven." He headed to the shed for charcoal, planning the afternoon in his head. His brother Tom would arrive with his kids around 3, and the neighbors the Washingtons had promised to stop by with homemade ice cream. Days like this made retirement feel like a blessing. As James rounded the corner of his house, he stopped dead in his tracks. A woman he'd never seen before was lounging on one of his pool chairs, her designer sandals kicked off beside her, a large floppy hat shading her face as she flipped through a glossy magazine. The gate to his fence stood slightly ajar. For a moment, James thought he must be mistaken. Maybe this was a friend of Diane's he hadn't met. But Diane was inside, and this stranger was acting completely at home. "Excuse me," James called, approaching slowly. "Can I help you with something?" The woman lowered her sunglasses, revealing pale blue eyes that swept over him without concern. He recognized her now, the same woman who'd slowed down in the SUV earlier that week. "Oh, I'm just cooling off," she replied with a wave of her hand. "It's such a hot day." James blinked, momentarily speechless. 25 years as a cop had prepared him for many situations, but finding a stranger lounging by his pool wasn't one of them. "I'm sorry, but this is a private pool," he explained, keeping his voice even. "This is my home." The woman sat up slightly, her expression shifting from casual to annoyed. "I'm Patricia Summers. I live over on Oakwood Drive." She gestured vaguely toward another street. The previous owners never minded neighbors using the pool during heat waves. James took a deep breath, calling on the same patience he used during tense traffic stops. "Well, I'm James Wilson, the current owner, and I do mind. We have family coming over soon, and this is our private property." Patricia's lips thinned into a tight line. "It's just a quick dip. No need to make a big deal out of it." "It is a big deal. You entered my property without permission." "The gate was open," she countered. "No, it wasn't," James said firmly. "I'd always keep it locked." Patricia gathered her magazine but made no move to leave. Instead, she looked around the yard with an appraising eye. "How long have you lived here anyway?" "I don't remember seeing you at the neighborhood potluck last month." "We moved in 6 months ago," James replied, increasingly uncomfortable with her tone. "Now, I'd appreciate if you'd gather your things and leave." Patricia stood slowly, slipping her feet into her sandals. "You know, this neighborhood has certain standards. The Thompsons who lived here before always understood community spirit." "Community spirit doesn't mean trespassing," James said, his patience wearing thin. "How would you feel if I walked into your backyard and made myself at home?" Something flashed in Patricia's eyes, surprise mixed with indignation. "That's hardly the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing." "You know, I'm friends with most of the homeowners around here," she said, her voice taking on an edge. "My husband is on the neighborhood watch." "I was a police sergeant for 25 years, James replied calmly. "I understand property laws quite well." Patricia's expression changed at the mention of his former profession, a flash of disbelief crossing her features. "You? A police officer?" "Yes, ma'am. Atlanta PD, retired just this year." She let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Well, someone like you should understand that neighbors need to get along. I don't appreciate your hostile attitude." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times when people made assumptions based on how he looked rather than who he was. "There's nothing hostile about asking someone to leave private property they were never invited onto," he said evenly. "Now, I need to get back to preparing for my family." Patricia gathered her things, her movements deliberately slow. "This isn't over," she said, heading toward the gate. "People around here won't like hearing about this." As she left, James stood watching, the peaceful day now tainted with an uneasiness. James thought the pool incident with Patricia was over, but life rarely worked out so neatly. 3 days later, he was trimming the hedges when he spotted her standing on the sidewalk in front of his house, talking on her phone while pointing at his property. She walked away quickly when she noticed him watching. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. James opened the door to find Patricia standing there with a fake smile, holding a plate of store-bought cookies wrapped in plastic. "I thought we should start over," she said, thrusting the plate forward. "Neighbors should be friends, after all." James hesitated, then accepted the cookies. "Thank you. That's thoughtful." Patricia peered past him into the house. "Lovely place you have. Mind if I come in? I'd love to chat about the neighborhood." "Now's not a good time," James replied. "Diane isn't feeling well today." The lie came easily. Something about Patricia set off alarm bells in his head, the same instinct that had kept him alive during his years on the force. Patricia's smile tightened. "I won't stay long. I actually wanted to discuss pool access. Summer's getting hotter, and several neighbors mentioned how the previous owners let people use." "I'm not the previous owners," James cut in firmly. "The pool is private. We have young grandchildren who visit regularly, and I'm concerned about safety and liability." Patricia's friendly facade cracked. "You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. People here share things. That's how communities work." "I'm happy to be neighborly in other ways," James offered, trying to diffuse the situation. "We're planning a cookout next month and would be glad to invite folks over." "A cookout isn't the same as pool access during a heat wave," Patricia snapped. Her eyes narrowed. "Look, I don't think you understand how things work here. This is a close-knit community. People who don't fit in tend to have problems." The threat hung in the air between them. James had heard similar words throughout his life, each time delivered with the same thinly veiled hostility. "Are you threatening me?" he asked quietly. Patricia took a step back, suddenly pulling out her phone. "I feel unsafe right now. You're being aggressive." James almost laughed at the absurdity. He hadn't moved an inch, his hands still holding the plate of cookies. "I'm standing in my doorway accepting cookies. How exactly am I being aggressive?" She began recording him with her phone. "I'm documenting this. You're intimidating me." "Please leave my property," James said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Now." "I'm calling the police," Patricia declared, fingers hovering over her phone. "I don't feel safe." 25 years of dealing with confrontations had taught James how to handle this moment. He set the cookies down on the porch bench and stepped back into his house. "Go ahead and call. I know most of the officers in this district. They'll be interested to hear about your trespassing on private property and making threats." Patricia's confident expression wavered. "I never trespassed." "I have security cameras," James lied, nodding toward the corner of the porch where no camera actually existed. "They caught you in my backyard by the pool." Her mouth opened and closed without words. For a moment, James thought she might leave. Instead, she recovered and doubled down. "You people always make everything about race," she hissed. "I'm just trying to maintain neighborhood standards." "You people?" James repeated softly. "I never mentioned race." "You did." The moment hung between them, a truth exposed that couldn't be unsaid. Patricia's face flushed red. "You'll regret this," she said, turning to leave. "People here take care of their own." As he watched her storm off down the sidewalk, James felt a heaviness settle over him. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. Experience told him Patricia wouldn't let this go, and neither could he. He had worked too hard for this home, this retirement, this peace. Inside, Diane was waiting, concern etched on her face. What was that about? James sighed, suddenly feeling tired. James woke up early the next Saturday, an old habit from his police days that retirement couldn't break. Coffee in hand, he strolled to the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard. The morning sun glinted off the pool water, creating dancing patterns of light. The peaceful scene was interrupted when he noticed something floating in the water. "What in the world?" he muttered, setting down his mug and heading outside. A beach towel drifted lazily in the deep end, bright pink with a flamingo pattern. Definitely not theirs. James fished it out with the pool net, water dripping as he examined the unfamiliar item. Then he noticed footprints on the concrete, small wet marks that weren't his or Diane's. Someone had been in their pool overnight. Diane joined him in the yard, tying her robe tighter against the morning chill. "What's that?" "Looks like we had visitors," James replied, pointing to the footprints. "Think it's time for those security cameras we talked about." By that afternoon, James had installed wireless cameras at key points around the property, one facing the pool, another the gate, and a third covering the front yard. The system linked to his phone, sending alerts whenever movement was detected. The expense hadn't been in their retirement budget, but peace of mind was worth the cost. 2 days later, his phone buzzed during dinner. The alert showed a familiar blonde figure at his back gate, testing the latch. Patricia was back, this time with another woman beside her. The fence is 8 feet on that side, the video caught Patricia saying. But if we come through the Thompsons' yard, their fence is only 6 feet, much easier to climb over. James clenched his jaw as he showed Diane the video. She's planning to break in again. Should we call the police? Diane asked. Not yet, James replied. Need more evidence first. The next day, James visited his neighbors, the Thompsons, an elderly couple who'd been warned to him and Diane from day one. Just wanted to let you know someone might try to enter your yard to get to our pool, James explained, showing them the video. Mrs. Thompson shook her head in disbelief. That's Patricia Summers. She's always causing trouble. Did the same thing to the Rodriguez family who used to live on Maple Street. Claimed their garden beds were eyesores and organized neighbors against them. Did anyone stand up to her? James asked. Not really. The Rodriguez family moved away eventually. Most folks just try to stay on her good side. That evening, James received another alert. This time, the video showed Patricia and 3 others, 2 women and a man, gathered outside his fence. He won't even know, Patricia was saying. They're out of town this weekend. My friend in the post office saw them put a vacation hold on their mail. James grimaced. They had considered going to visit Diane's sister, but had decided against it at the last minute. Let's just wait until dark, one of the women suggested. The pool lights are on a timer, Patricia replied. We'll have plenty of light to swim. The group left, but James knew they'd be back. He called his old partner, Frank, who was still on the force. You sure about this, James? Frank asked over the phone. Could just be entitled folks, not worth the hassle. It's my property, James replied firmly. And it's not just about the pool anymore. This woman's spreading rumors about us, planning break-ins, trying to get others involved. All right, document everything. I'll let some of the guys on patrol know to drive by your place tonight. James hung up and found Diane watching him from the doorway. We could just let them use the pool, she suggested quietly. Might be easier. James took her hand. If it was just about swimming, maybe, but you know it's not. Give in once, they'll keep pushing. We'd earned this place. We're not giving up an inch of it. As darkness fell, James turned on the pool lights as usual. Then he and Diane settled into lawn chairs on their darkened porch, waiting. The security system was armed, cameras recording, and his James and Diane didn't have to wait long. Around 9 o'clock, their security system sent an alert. On his phone screen, James watched Patricia and her 3 friends approaching the back fence, carrying towels and a cooler. They wore swimsuits under light cover-ups, and Patricia held what looked like a small pair of bolt cutters. They're actually going to cut our lock, James whispered to Diane, who sat beside him on their darkened porch. Should we go out there now? Diane asked. James shook his head. Let's get it all on video first. The group reached the gate, and Patricia handed the bolt cutters to the man. He positioned them around the lock. Wait, Patricia said, her voice carrying in the quiet night. Let me try the code first. She punched a series of numbers into the keypad lock. James frowned. How would she know our code? The answer came quickly when the lock beeped and clicked open. Patricia smiled triumphantly. The previous owners never changed it, she told her friends. I figured these people wouldn't either. James felt a chill. They had indeed kept the existing lock, assuming the code was private. A rookie mistake. The group slipped inside, closing the gate behind them. They set their things on the pool chairs and began removing their cover-ups, laughing and talking in hushed voices. Cov enough? James asked Diane, who nodded. They stood and walked around the side of the house. James flipped on the bright security lights, flooding the backyard. Patricia and her friends froze like deer in headlights. Evening, folks, James said calmly, approaching with Diane beside him. Enjoying my property? Patricia recovered quickly. We thought you were out of town. Clearly, James replied. Otherwise, you wouldn't be trespassing. The gate was open, one of the women said weakly. No, it wasn't, James countered. You used the old code to unlock it. That's breaking and entering. The man in the group stepped forward. Look, there's been a misunderstanding. Patricia said you were cool with neighbors using the pool. James looked at Patricia. Is that what you told them? Because we've had multiple conversations where I explicitly said the opposite. Patricia's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. You can't hog a pool like this in the middle of summer, Patricia snapped, desperation creeping into her voice. It's selfish. It's private property, James replied. And you're trespassing, all of you. He pulled out his phone. I've already called the police. They're on their way. The man grabbed his towel. I'm out of here. Patricia, you said this was all arranged. It was. Patricia insisted, though her voice had lost its certainty. He's bluffing about the police. As if on cue, blue lights flashed at the front of the house, and the sound of car doors slamming carried into the backyard. Still think I'm bluffing? James asked. Two officers walked around the side of the house, led by Frank, James's former partner. Recognition flashed across Frank's face, quickly replaced by professional detachment. Evening, folks. Got a report of trespassing, Frank said, taking in the scene. Care to explain what's going on here? Patricia stepped forward, tears suddenly appearing in her eyes. Officer, we were invited here. Then she pointed at James, started threatening us. Frank looked at James. Sir? Security footage shows them breaking in using bolt cutters on my lock, James said, the lie coming easily. They thought we were out of town. That's not true, Patricia protested. James held up his phone, showing the video of Patricia punching in the code. They didn't use bolt cutters because they knew the code, but they definitely weren't invited. Frank nodded. Ma'am, you and your friends need to come with us. You're taking his side? Patricia looked shocked. Do you know who my husband is? He's on the city council. Ma'am, I don't care if your husband is the president, Frank replied evenly. Trespassing is trespassing. Now you can all come down to the station willingly, or we can make this more difficult. As the officers escorted the group away, Patricia turned back, her face twisted with anger. This isn't over, she hissed. You have no idea who you're dealing with. James watched them go, feeling no satisfaction, just wariness. He knew Patricia was right about one thing: this wasn't over. People like her didn't give. The morning after the pool incident, James sat at his kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. He'd been up since dawn, making calls and taking notes. Diane placed a fresh cup of coffee beside him and peered over his shoulder. What's all this? She asked, eyeing the stack of documents. Research, James replied, tapping a folder labeled Property Records. I spent 25 years learning how people like Patricia operate. They don't stop until they face real consequences. After Patricia and her friends had been escorted off his property, James knew she would retaliate. People who were used to getting their way didn't back down easily. His years as a police officer had taught him that. Frank called this morning, James continued. They didn't arrest Patricia or her friends, just issued warnings for trespassing. That's something at least, Diane said. James shook his head. It won't stop her, so I'm changing tactics. Later that day, James visited the local courthouse. The clerk looked confused when he explained what he needed, but she helped anyway. By afternoon, he had what he came for: official records showing property lines, neighborhood bylaws, and something even more interesting: complaints filed against Patricia Summers over the past 5 years. 6 official complaints from 5 different neighbors, James told Diane when he returned home. 2 for harassment, 1 for property damage, 1 for verbal assault, and 2 for trespassing. But none of them pressed charges. Why not? Diane asked. Probably the same reason people put up with her nonsense now: easier to avoid the fight. The next day, a letter arrived from a law firm representing Patricia, claiming James had intimidated and threatened her and her friends during a neighborly gathering. The letter demanded he make his pool available to neighbors twice weekly or face a lawsuit for disturbing community peace. James laughed and filed the letter with his growing collection of evidence. That evening, James and Diane hosted a small dinner. Their guests included Frank and his wife, the Thompsons from next door, and the Chens from across the street. After a pleasant meal, James explained why he'd invited them. I think it's time this neighborhood stopped letting one person run things through intimidation, he said, showing them the complaints he'd found. Patricia's been bullying people for years. Mrs. Thompson nodded. Everyone's afraid to stand up to her. Her husband has connections at City Hall. Connections don't put you above the law, Frank chimed in. If enough neighbors came forward with complaints, something could be done. That's exactly what I was thinking, James agreed. Not just about the pool, about her pattern of behavior. The group discussed their experiences with Patricia. The Chens revealed she tried to get them fined for their vegetable garden, claiming it violated appearance codes that didn't actually exist. The Thompsons mentioned how she'd spread rumors about previous homeowners who didn't go along with her demands. What do you suggest? Mr. Chen asked. A neighborhood meeting, James proposed. A real one, not Patricia's selective gatherings. We invite everyone, including her, and address these issues openly. The others looked nervous but ultimately agreed. Flyers were printed, emails sent, and phone calls made. James reserved the community center for the following Saturday. When the day arrived, James was surprised to see nearly 40 neighbors fill the room, far more than he expected. Patricia arrived late, flanked by a few supporters. Her expression darkened when she spotted James at the front of the room. "What's this about?" she demanded loudly. "Community standards," James replied calmly, echoing the phrase she'd used against him. "Please, take a seat." As the meeting began, James briefly introduced himself and explained the purpose of the gathering, to discuss real neighborhood concerns and establish respectful boundaries between neighbors. He never mentioned Patricia by name, but her face grew redder with each passing minute. When he opened the floor for discussion, James expected silence. Instead, one by one, neighbors began to speak about their experiences, not just with Patricia, but with feeling intimidated and excluded from neighborhood decisions. An older gentleman stood up. "I've lived here 20 years, and I've never felt welcome at the gatherings at certain homes." Others nodded in agreement. As more people shared their stories, James watched the dynamics of the room shift. The neighborhood meeting lasted almost 3 hours. By the end, Patricia had stormed out, her face flushed with anger, while most neighbors stayed behind, exchanging phone numbers and making plans. It was the first time many of them had really talked to each other despite living on the same streets for years. 2 days later, James was trimming his hedges when a car pulled into his driveway. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, his face tight with barely contained frustration. "Mr. Wilson?" "I'm Robert Summers," he said, extending his hand. "Patricia's husband." James set down his trimmer and wiped his palms on his jeans before shaking the man's hand. "What can I do for you?" Robert glanced toward the house. "Could we talk privately?" They sat on the front porch, where James offered Robert a glass of iced tea. For a moment, neither spoke, just two men sizing each other up across a small table. "That was quite a meeting you organized," Robert finally said. "Seemed necessary," James replied simply. Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I'll be straight with you. Patricia is difficult sometimes. She has strong opinions about how things should be." James waited, saying nothing. "The thing is," Robert continued, looking uncomfortable, "she's never had anyone stand up to her like this. Most people just give in eventually." "I'm not most people," James said. "Clearly." Robert took a long drink of his tea. "She's talking about getting lawyers involved, organizing neighbors against you, even trying to create some kind of homeowners association just to make rules about pools." James smiled. "Sounds like a lot of work just to swim in someone else's backyard." "It's not about the pool anymore," Robert admitted. "It's about her pride. She can't stand losing." "I'm not interested in making anyone lose," James replied. "I just want to enjoy my retirement without trespassers in my yard." Robert nodded slowly. "I understand. That's why I'm here without Patricia knowing. To see if we can find a solution that lets everyone save face." James considered this. 25 years in law enforcement had taught him that sometimes the best resolution wasn't about winning or losing, but finding a way forward that worked for everyone. "I might have an idea," he said finally. The following weekend, colorful flyers appeared throughout the neighborhood announcing the first annual summer block party to be held on the community green. James and Diane were listed as organizers, along with several other neighbors, including Robert Summers. Patricia was noticeably absent from the planning committee, though Robert assured everyone she would attend. Meanwhile, another novice went out. James and Diane would be hosting monthly pool parties throughout the summer, with limited spots available through a neighborhood sign-up system. "You're actually going to let people use our pool?" Diane asked as they prepared for the block party. "On our terms," James clarified. 4 hours once a month with clear rules and our supervision. Seems like a reasonable compromise. The day of the block party arrived with perfect weather. Neighbors brought dishes to share, children played games on the grass, and a sense of genuine community filled the air. James manned the grill, chatting easily with people who had been strangers just weeks before. 2 hours into the party, Patricia arrived with Robert. She hung back at first, clearly uncomfortable. James watched from a distance as Robert gently encouraged her to join the gathering. Eventually, Patricia approached the food table where Diane was arranging desserts. The two women spoke briefly. Though Diane's smile remained fixed, she nodded several times before Patricia moved on. Later, as the party was winding down, Patricia made her way to James, who was cleaning the grill. "Robert says you're hosting pool parties," she said stiffly. "That's right," James replied. "First one's next Saturday. There's a sign-up sheet if you're interested." Patricia looked at the ground, then back at James. "Your wife says you were a sergeant." 25 years, James confirmed. "My father was an officer in Boston," Patricia said, her voice slightly softer. "Before he passed." James nodded, understanding something new about her. "Good department." An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Patricia cleared her throat. "The block party was nice," she admitted. "Better than the small gatherings I used to host." It wasn't quite an apology, but James recognized it as the closest thing he would get. "Community works better when everyone's included," he said simply. As Patricia walked away to join her husband, James felt a weight lift from